Okay, hi everybody. Today what I wanted to do was take a little bit of a look at this whole idea of where the camera is and where your subject is. Couple things we have to start looking at when we're looking at any time that you tilt the camera either up to take a picture of a tall building or a tree or whatever, or in this case, down to do some product type photos, right? Anytime you change that angle of the sensor, the plane of the sensor as it relates to the plane of your subject, right, you're going to potentially have problems. Now, we all know the issue of tilting up, right? When you tilt up, obviously the bottom of the lens is much closer to the building at the bottom than the top is. So you get that warped sense or that sense of the building leaning back and kind of the whole converging line issue with looking at a building. Now, the problem doesn't go away because you're closer and you don't have to tilt as much. And you can see my setup here, right? The camera is noticeably tilted down to photograph the box. Now, obviously, I'm doing this for the camera, and I would most likely, be shooting this vertically, right? Because it's a tall subject, right? But it's still the same problem, right? The lens and the camera body and the sensor are tilted down. So you're going to have the same kind of a problem with the edges or the perspective or the angle of view, all how you want to look at this, are going to be altered. Because now you're going to get the opposite. Rather than the lines going together for shooting a tall building, the lines are going to start coming together shooting a product. So you're going to get the same kind of idea of this converging, diverging line, however, which way you want to look at it, that is going to alter slightly how the product looks. Okay, so how do you get around doing this, right? You typically want to have the camera a little bit higher than your subject, because that gives you a nice angle or a window into the subject, right? So that's a nice view. So we have to be careful about having the camera, too low and shooting our subject kind of straight on, right? Because that's kind of boring. So you always have to be careful about where the camera height is in relationship to your subject and how much tilt you have in relation to your subject. Now, there's a couple things you can do, right? You can back up. So as you back up, you can zoom in, and your angle of tilt will get less, or it's perceived less. As you zoom in on the subject, you don't have to tilt as much to get that angle of view. So you can back up and use a bigger lens if you have enough room to back up. So you can back up and use a bigger lens. You essentially can start flattening out the lens, just like if you were to photograph a tall building. If you're up close, you have to really tilt the camera and the lens up. As you get further away, you can begin to flatten the lens out. As you zoom in, you can begin to flatten that angle out a little bit. So your perspective is shifted a little bit from tilting way up to coming back. So the same situation applies when you're shooting a product and the camera's up a little bit higher than the product and you're tilted down. As you back up, you can begin to flatten that angle out a little bit and drop the camera slightly and get a nice looking angle or perspective on the product as well, okay? So that's just something with a simple product like this. Now the other thing you can do, which gets to be a little bit of a pain because you have to stick something underneath your whatever you're using, is to look at tilting the product slightly. Now that's way too much, but you get the idea about tilting the product slightly. So, you know, a few pieces of paper, say, stuck underneath here, so you can tilt the product back. Now you're looking at aligning the sensor plane or the camera plane, right? You have it tilted down and your product is straight up and down. But if you can tilt that product slightly, either way to affect a more alignment of your sensor and your product, right? So sometimes that can work really well to look at tilting the product ever so slightly to help with that. Now, the other way that you can do this is to look at shooting it fairly wide. So let's say your composition really wants to be tight on the box. Well, if you shoot it wider, right, then you can go into Photoshop or Lightroom and use perspective correction, right? Lens correction, it's under one of the filters in Photoshop. And you can pull the image forward or back, depending upon what your situation is, to kind of straighten out the perspective, or as I said, in Photoshop it's called lens correction. In Lightroom it's down, in classic Lightroom it's down on the right side pretty far down, and it says lens correction. I think it says lens correction too. So you can do that, but you have to shoot it considerably wider than your normal good composition would be, because you need room to bring that image forward or backward, and you don't want it to bump into the top of the frame as you rotate that through its movement, okay? So you get the idea of how that has to work. So you have to shoot it wider, considerably wider, like 20% wider. So a noticeable amount different, you have to photograph that. So we got three different strategies here. One, back up a little bit and zoom in, and then you can flatten the camera out a little bit, okay? Two is tilt the product one way or the other, depending upon what you're trying to show or how you're trying to capture it, or what your camera position is relative to the product. And three is to shoot it wider and correct it in post-production. Okay, so we've got a couple of different thoughts and ideas to shoot here about where the camera needs to be in terms of perspective, in terms of height, and in terms of tilting the sensor plane one way or the other, okay? Now this applies to just about anything that you're going to photograph, right, that has some height to it, right? You get into shooting something pretty small, a cup like that, right? That's probably not going to be too big a deal. But you get into shooting taller objects, right? I've got a couple more here, sitting over here. You get into shooting a couple of taller objects, right? Here's a box of crackers. Now this one's pretty easy because it's a pretty thick box. So it'd be pretty easy to tilt that a little bit. Then you got to be careful. You don't want to tilt it a lot because that'll look funny to have a gap underneath in the front of the picture, right? So that can be pretty good because it's a good sized box. Now bottles are a little bit more difficult, right? Because really what you end up having to do is try to tilt the whole platform here. So I could put something underneath my support in the front and tilt the whole piece of wood I have underneath here, right? So I got a little piece of plywood underneath here is what I'm using, okay? So you could tilt the whole piece of plywood, right, to get your perspective or angle, because you don't want this to fall over. And again, you don't want to have gappage underneath. It'll look funny. So a few things that you can do to help correct your perspective or offer you some options as to what you can do with your sensor camera plane and your subject plane. This can also be a big deal, especially when we're in this tight, as it relates to depth of field. Remember, 3 components of depth of field: f-stop, camera to subject distance, millimeter of lens. Okay, so if we're looking at our subject and the camera is tilted down and our subject straight, now our depth of field is going to extend this way. But if we can align the plane of our subject and the plane of our camera better, now our depth of field is going to go in this direction. Right? So you have to be careful of that when you start to tilt the camera down, because now your depth of field isn't going to extend forwards and backwards. As you tilt it, it's going to follow the plane of the sensor, and your depth of field is now going to go this way rather than this way. So depending upon your product and how much depth you have in your product from front to back, think something that's got a little bit more depth to it. Right? There's a little bit of depth from that front corner to that back corner. So in terms of depth of field, you know, get out the depth of field calculator on your phone or go to dofmaster.com and do the calculation. Get a tape measure out, and remember where the measurement is. It's not to the front of the lens. It's that white mark, right? Remember, it's the little white mark, the empty set mark. Right? It looks like the little circle with a line through it. That's where you measure to. Don't measure to the lens, you measure to there. Okay? So then you could see what the difference in dimension is from this leading edge closest to the camera to this far edge back of the camera. And you could simply punch that in the depth of field calculator and you'll know what you'll need. But that can help you straighten out and know that you can't have it tilted so much. Maybe you can only have it tilted or angled this much because you need 2 inches of depth of field. Well, you know, at 200 millimeters at f/16, at 5 feet or 4 feet away from your subject, you're not going to get a lot of depth of field. So a couple of different things to look at. I know I gave you a lot, but hey, I just want you to have fun and try some stuff and just be aware of all this stuff. And look, play around. I was up till 2 o'clock in the morning last night. I just grabbed some stuff I had laying around the house, my old motorcycle helmet, and I started photographing this. I was up till 2 o'clock in the morning photographing this. I'll post you a couple pictures I got of it. I wanted to get a nice glow on the goggles, and I finally got that. So that was pretty fun. So I'm just kind of goofing around just like you guys are and doing stuff. Yeah, I got a couple of tools here I can work with, and I've got some space, I get it. But nevertheless, you know, I sat down about 11:30 and got the camera out and just started goofing around. And this was one of my softbox setups I had over here. So I kind of wanted to show you that. It's sitting on a chair. That's a plastic drawer from a little drawer set. And I have a sheer curtain and a plastic bag over it. Then I had to cut the light down even more, so I put a pillowcase over it to cut the light down to match what I was doing. And I'll post that picture so you guys can see it. So that was a lot of fun. You know, I was just kind of goofing around. You know, why not? Behind the camera, playing around, trying some things. I was up to about 8 seconds or 4 seconds on exposure, about f/22, something like that. And I was using a flashlight plus this little softbox, and I had a light stuck up inside the helmet as well. I'll send out an email and post that picture so you can see it. Something fun to play around with. Okay, great. Have fun with this. Remember, 4 total advertising pictures, 4 total. Was it 3 total? Yeah, 3 of your own, or three ads and then 1 of your own. And if you want to do all 4 of your own, I don't care at this point, right? Just have some fun. Play around, do some tabletop stuff, and see what you can get, okay? All right, very good. See you next week.